Hello and welcome back to all of our fabulous listeners. I hope that you had an amazing holiday season. I wanted to create a mini-sode following up on one of the topics that we briefly mentioned during our holiday episode. I talked about a period in my life when I got a little bit excessive with trying to eliminate plastic from my routine. Some of you, while you were listening to that, might have noticed that it sounded a little bit like OCD. So I thought that was worth a deeper discussion. I want to dive deeper into what is OCD, where does it overlap with ADHD and autism, and how do you even tell the difference? So let's jump right in.
Welcome to It's Just AuDHD. We're two curious ADHD coaches, and we're going deep on the how, the why, and the strategies to get through the difficult moments and how to make the best of life with AuDHD. I'm John, and I've got an adult diagnosis of ADHD.
And I'm Tarah, and I have a late-in-life ADHD diagnosis and an even later autism diagnosis. We're going to be diving headfirst into the messy and often complicated research around ADHD and autism. And we're bringing you along for the journey as we break it all down and make sense of everything.
Because sometimes it's just life.
And sometimes it's just AuDHD. So before we begin, I just want to remind you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. It is not intended to replace professional medical care. We are not doctors. We don't claim to be. We are just a couple of nerds who find this information and this research really fascinating and we want to discuss it, but please keep your medical decisions between you and your doctor and keep us out of it. All right, let's begin. So first of all, what is OCD? I think one of the things that it has in common with both ADHD and autism is that the public perception of what OCD is doesn't really match the actual presentation and the lived experience of the people who have it. So kind of in the same vein, when people are forgetful or hyperactive or something for a day and they go, oh, everybody's a little bit ADHD. You hear that a lot with OCD where people will try to organize a desk or straighten out a picture and they go, oh, it's just my OCD. And to be honest, that's not at all what OCD is. Unfortunately, it has just taken on a very different meaning when it's used colloquially. So imagine there's a television set and it's got a bunch of different channels on it. One of those channels has really distressing content, like gory, bloody, graphic horror movies or something. Insert whatever type of channel you would find really distressing if you had to watch it for 24 hours a day. So most people have a functional remote and they're able to change the channel. And so they might stop on this channel for a minute or two, but once they see something too graphic, they're going to change the channel. Maybe your channel button even gets stuck for a couple more minutes, but you're still able to be overall in control and change the channel when you want to. Well, for someone with OCD, the remote is completely broken. They're not able to flip away. And their television set is stuck on this really graphic, distressing channel. So you can imagine if you were in that situation, you might become increasingly desperate to try and figure out how to get the remote to work again. And so that's kind of what's happening. They're mashing different buttons in different order and stuff like that just to try and figure out something to get this awful channel to turn off. And sometimes it might even work if you do just the right combo of buttons. So that's where compulsions come into play. They're trying to do things to alleviate these really distressing thoughts. And so to an outside observer whose channel, whose remote control is functional, they would be like, what are you doing? Just click the channel button, just change the channel. But someone with OCD can't do that. And so the problem is even if those compulsions pay off, even if they press the right number of buttons in the right order and it changes for the day, it's gonna come back tomorrow and it's gonna get stuck on that channel again. And so it's just kind of the same process over and over, rinse and repeat. And that's why OCD is such a serious condition and really shouldn't be taken lightly. People shouldn't act like, oh, everyone's a little OCD, because that's really offensive. Now, people with ADHD and autism may have a similar problem where our controller is broken and we can't change the channel. But the difference is that our television set gets stuck on like our favorite TV show. And so this would be like our special interests or hyperfixations, right? And so an outside observer might be like, oh my gosh, that's so bad that your controller is broken. You need to go in and get that fixed. But for us, it's like, why would we? We're watching the program that we would otherwise want to watch anyway. Like, it's not a big deal. And in fact, if someone told us that it's bad that we're watching our favorite TV show over and over all day and that we need to like change that, that would actually decrease our quality of life because we're watching exactly what we want to watch. And so that's kind of the key difference, is that for us, our minds get stuck on like a special interest or hyperfixation, but it's not a negative experience. It's a positive experience, in fact. But for someone with OCD, it's a deeply distressing experience, and that's what drives them to have compulsions to try and help alleviate those distressing thoughts. Another thing that it has in common with both ADHD and autism is that it's behaviors that everybody exhibits from time to time, but it's really defined by the severity and frequency of those behaviors. So in the same vein that, like, yes, every once in a while people lose their keys, with ADHD, those memory issues happen every single day, and it has a tremendous impact on your life. The same can be true of OCD. Everybody has obsessions from time to time, and everybody has compulsions from time to time. But with OCD, it is a daily occurrence, and the magnitude matters quite a bit. So to give you kind of a point of reference, they use what's called the Yale-Brown Scale to be able to measure your OCD. That's the test that they typically administer. And that test has scaling questions to basically figure out how extreme are your obsessions and your compulsions. And so on that test, the categories are like, I have obsessive thoughts for 3 to 8 hours per day, or I have obsessive thoughts 8+ hours per day. And so a lot of the times, the people that are colloquially using the term OCD would be ruled out just on that metric alone, because when they're sitting there straightening out a painting or washing their hands a couple times, they're not also thinking about washing their hands for an additional 3 hours or 8 hours or longer. Now, the problem is that for someone with ADHD or autism, thinking about one thing for 8 hours per day with our hyperfixations and with our special interests can actually be kind of normal for us. And so that's where the water starts to get a little bit muddier, where the distinction is. To be honest, we tend to naturally score a little bit higher on tests like the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale, just by the very nature of ADHD and autism. First, I'll give you a couple clear-cut examples of what OCD is, where it really doesn't overlap with ADHD or autism. Basically, with OCD, you have an obsessive and distressing thought, and you have this thought over and over and over all day long. You can't banish the thought, because everybody has intrusive thoughts. You know, like everybody driving a car once or twice has had the thought like, oh, what if I just drove off the side of a bridge or something? But the difference is that for most other people, you can banish that thought and just be like, oh, that's weird, that's not nice, and not think about it again. But with OCD, you don't have that same level of control over your own brain. You would have that thought recurring many hours per day. It causes distress, and it may or may not include compulsions. So you don't necessarily actually have to have compulsions, even though it's called obsessive compulsive disorder. There's a form of OCD called pure O, where it's just the obsessive thoughts and you don't act on any sort of compulsions. But for the people who do have compulsions, that compulsion is a response to the repeated thought. So it's not like something out of nowhere. You're not washing your hands or something like that out of nowhere. It's directly tied to that obsessive thought because you're trying to get it to go away. If you're afraid of being dirty and contracting a disease that will kill you, you're washing your hands 20 times to try and make sure that thing doesn't happen. So there's a very direct correlation between the obsessive thought and the compulsion if you have compulsions. So here are a couple OCD examples that are very common that I don't think really overlap with ADHD or autism. So a very common one is, I'm afraid I will kill insert blank, your spouse, a cat, a baby, something like that. Now, this might sound alarming at first, but the thing is, people with OCD would never actually do that. It's not congruent with their character or their morals or ethics or values or anything like that. If you are interested in killing someone, that's not OCD, that's something else. And so the way that you can kind of suss that out is if you ask them, okay, have you ever wanted to kill a baby? And they would answer emphatically, no, absolutely not. I don't want to kill a baby. And you could ask them, have you ever killed a baby? And again, the answer would be absolutely not. And so they're not having these thoughts because they're inherently violent or anything like that. It's simply a distressing thought that is occurring that has nothing to do with who they are as a person. And so I hope you can start to imagine how horrendous it would be to have thoughts that aren't within your control and to have them over and over and over, and how it could really affect your self-esteem and the lengths that you would go to try and get those thoughts to stop occurring in your brain. OCD is a deeply distressing disorder. Another really common example is, I'm afraid that my food is poisoned, and so people will go to very extreme measures to make sure that there's no poison in their food. Now, it doesn't always have to be a logical thought. You could cognitively know, okay, this food is packaged, it's from a grocery store, there's no way it's poisoned. But the OCD isn't dependent on whether it's a logical thing. It's a driver that's not coming from a logical place. And so, of course, if you're having this thought, you might act on a compulsion to go to extreme lengths to try to alleviate that anxiety and that horrible feeling of just having that recurring thought, is my food poisoned? Is my food poisoned? There are other common ones like unwanted sexual thoughts, and they have no bearing on your sexuality. They can just come out of nowhere. It can be someone who you're not attracted to. It can even be someone of a gender that you're not attracted to. And you just have that thought over and over and over. And it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that you're secretly attracted to them. It's just a thought. That's the thing. That's the common theme with OCD thoughts, is it's just a thought, and it doesn't really depend on anything about the person. There's also common religious fears. So if someone is particularly religious, they might have a thought that they're going to commit a sin. And so they might feel compelled to pray for hours and hours and hours a day to atone for some sort of sin that their brain has cooked up, that they're convinced that they're going to go to hell because of. There's also health anxiety. That one's a really common one as well, believing that you will become sick or die for some reason. And that one can also be completely debilitating. So I feel those are very clear-cut ones that don't really feel like autism or ADHD, but there are also a number of them that do kind of overlap. So I'm going to take you through a couple examples from that Yale-Brown obsessive compulsive scale. So one of them is, I fear doing something embarrassing. For example, fear of appearing foolish in social situations. Of course, that sounds like autism. And with autism, you may have many hours of thoughts per day, scripting out in social situations what you're going to say so that you can not appear foolish. And so that's a common overlap one. That one I think is a little bit hard to suss out if that's OCD or autism. Another one is feeling the need to know or remember certain things, and the example they give is license plate numbers, the names of actors on television shows, old telephone numbers, bumper stickers. So that again can feel a little bit like an autism special interest, but this one is a little bit easier to distinguish. With special interests with autism, it's coming from a place of enjoying that topic. It's coming from a happier place. Whereas with OCD, it's coming from a place of anxiety. It's coming from a place of, if I don't remember these insignificant numbers, something horrible will happen. A family member will die. I will die. A stranger will die. On that sort of order of magnitude. And so the motivation is really the crux of the issue with this one. Another one is that you're bothered by intrusive mental nonsense sounds, words, or music. So like words or songs or music is playing in your mind that you can't stop. Of course, this sounds a little bit like echolalia. And in fact, another compulsion that they list is repeating certain phrases over and over and over. So the distinguishing factor, again, you're going to see this is the common theme, is with echolalia, which is a common autism trait, where we repeat noises or phrases or sound effects or something like that over and over. It's actually a form of stimming. And so we aren't doing it because we're like afraid of the consequences if we don't. We're doing it because it simply feels good. And so that's a really major distinguisher between the two. Another common one that has a lot of overlap with ADHD is checking things. So going back and checking 10, 15, 20, 100 times that you turned off the stove, that you locked the door, things like that. And this can sound a lot like ADHD because we do have to check with our working memory deficits to make sure that we did those things. But the difference to ask yourself is if you just have ADHD and someone was like there with you and they told you like, yep, definitively, I saw you turn off the stove, or like I saw you lock the door or something, would you put it out of your mind? And I think most people with ADHD would be like, hell yeah, I'm so glad to not have to think about that or worry about that anymore. And you wouldn't think about it again for the rest of the day. But with OCD, you're still going to have that compulsion to want to go back and check, even if you can say for certain, even if you had a video feed and like saw it on a camera, yes, I turned off the stove or I locked the door, that checking compulsion, that desire to go back and check is still going to be there. But I hope that this gives you a little bit of an insight onto what OCD is and where the overlap comes from. How much do these conditions overlap? For both ADHD and autism, it's quite a bit. The statistics are a little bit different depending on which studies you reference, but some of them have found that like 30% of individuals with OCD may also have ADHD, for example. And the inverse is true of people who have been diagnosed with ADHD. They think like 17 to 25% of them exhibit symptoms of OCD. Those numbers will have to like settle out to a common place at some point because obviously the overlap on both sides should probably be the same, but the research on all this stuff is new and it takes a while for it to settle in. And then the same is true of OCD and autism. They found that autistic people have twice the risk of being diagnosed with OCD later in life, and people with OCD are 4 times more likely to receive an autism diagnosis. They also have said that nearly half of all people with OCD show significant autistic traits, which I don't love the term autistic traits just because the line between autistic traits and like autism proper, is kind of an arbitrary human-made definition by a handful of like researchers and clinicians. So I think it's fair to say that half of people are probably just autistic. So in those studies, they've shown that around half of all the people with OCD score above the clinical threshold when taking the autism quotient, which is one of the diagnostic tests for autism. So there's quite a bit of overlap between these conditions, as you can see. But how do we know that it's real? Like, how do we know that the tests for OCD aren't just misdiagnosing people with autism and ADHD and vice versa? They've actually done genetic studies as well to look into this. So as a reminder, autism is a polygenic inheritance condition, What that means is there are multiple genes that control the expression of autism. It's not just like one single gene, and it is a highly genetic condition, if not entirely genetic. So the reason that people talk about the autism spectrum, it doesn't mean that everybody is a little bit autistic and exists on the spectrum. It actually means that of the people who are autistic, their traits exist on a spectrum. So one person might have a little bit more rigid routines and might be a little bit more of a systemizer, but have maybe like less social impairments. And then somebody else might have more social impairments, but might be a little less rigid, things like that. So it's all on a spectrum of the group of people who are in fact autistic. The reason for that is because there are so many genes dictating the inheritance of autism, and your particular expression depends on which of those genes you inherited. And by the way, this is the same exact thing for ADHD. It is also a polygenic inheritance condition. And we know for certain with ADHD, it's like 100% genetic. There's no question. And there's even very little evidence that it's epigenetic, which means that expression can be turned on or off. What the research has largely shown is ADHD will happen if you have those genes. Your environment doesn't really matter at all. So there's moral of the story. There's a lot of genes that control autism, and it seems like it's similar with OCD. There was one paper that showed that of the 624 autism genes, I told you there's a lot, and the 86 OCD genes that they've identified, there was overlap of 43 genes. So both of these conditions share 43 genes. That's half of the OCD genes. So clearly there is a genetic component that is driving the co-inheritance of both autism and OCD. And we have the study linked in the description, by the way. What's actually going on in the brain, though, to cause OCD? Unfortunately, I did some research and it seems a little bit muddy, if I'm being honest. Some studies suggest that it's a difference in serotonin levels. And this kind of makes sense because the most common medication for treating OCD is an SSRI, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And if you remember from our ketamine episode, what this means is that if your brain was a bucket with holes in it and you had a water faucet, basically dumping water into the buckets, what the SSRI is doing is blocking a couple of those holes in the serotonin bucket so that you have more available serotonin at any given time. So that's the theory behind why the medicine works for some people with OCD. There are other studies that actually show that it's a difference between GABA and glutamate levels, like having an imbalance. And that one's really interesting to me because that's actually the same root cause as autism. And so that makes sense with how much genetic overlap there is, where you would have either too low of GABA or too high of glutamate. And so your neurons are firing too frequently because GABA and glutamates are the ones that control how often your neurotransmitters fire, and so they have to be in perfect balance so that you don't have over or under firing for all the neurons in your brain. Finally, there were a couple studies that I found that actually showed that it was too low BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotropic factor. And if you remember from the ketamine episode, that is also the chemical that controls the regrowth of dendritic spines. So in other words, that's the chemical that helps with brain regrowth or neuroplasticity. And that one was interesting to me as well because they're doing some preliminary research on whether OCD can be helped with ketamine, because that's what ketamine does. It helps indirectly through a really long chain reaction to increase the level of BDNF in your brain. So what we might find down the road is that maybe it has multiple root causes or something like that. Or maybe someone will come up with a theory to unify why all of these things seem to be true. But it seems to me that right now we don't have the clearest understanding of what causes OCD. So now I want to talk about a couple examples from my life and how those may or may not fit into the OCD picture. So I already shared the plastic example, and I'll talk about that more later, but I do want to mention that I don't necessarily self-identify as a person with OCD. So this is from a purely non-clinical perspective, and I think you could maybe make arguments in both directions that what I experienced was or was not OCD. But from my own just self-conceptualization, from my own perspective, I don't necessarily feel like I need the OCD label just because I feel like everything that I've experienced is sufficiently explained through ADHD and autism. And so I don't know that like the label of OCD really adds any deeper understanding for me personally. But again, that's not necessarily from a clinically informed perspective. That's just from like my own self-image and what labels I do or don't think fit. So I think it'd be fair to say that I'm a fairly obsessive personality, but that doesn't necessarily mean OCD. And I think that many people who are ADHD or autistic would also be described as like a obsessive personality. And this has always been true my entire life. Now, interestingly, OCD also generally starts in childhood. For most people, you can have your first OCD episode at like adulthood, but it's pretty rare for that to happen after age like 35 or 40. Like generally, you will have an episode a lot earlier in life. And then for most people, it's also recurring. So they will kind of phase in and out of having like the more severe OCD episodes throughout their life. And so that's why it's really important. We're going to talk later about what you can do if you feel like these descriptions resonate with you. But it is really important to get treatment so that you're able to cope with it for now and for in the future as well. For me, I've certainly had very obsessive episodes, and I'm going to talk about one that was strictly good, strictly positive, one that was kind of mixed, and then one that was negative, and differentiate them. And so clinicians, if any of you are listening, I think that this is the crux of the issue. For people who are ADHD or autistic, we will have kind of obsessive episodes, but it's really important to not pathologize them because they may be bringing us joy, particularly if they're tied to like a special interest or hyperfixation. And if you pathologize them, it ends up bringing us a lot of like shame and guilt, and it makes us stop doing behaviors that are not only natural for us, but actually beneficial, because engaging with special interests and hyperfixations is a really good way for autistic people and ADHD people to manage stress levels and just generally feel more fulfilled. So the first example for me is doing research on medical conditions, especially ADHD and autism. I've had medical professionals suggest that this is like some sort of health phobia. I've had them call it like a health anxiety thing before, and this is just not the case. Doing research, doing this stuff genuinely brings me joy, not only because I get to understand myself, like how cool is it that there are books and studies and stuff written about my specific brain? I think that's awesome. I always joke that I come with a user manual and all the neurotypicals are a mystery. But it also allows me to help my friends. Like I've had people come to me with issues and I'm like, hang on, let me pull out the study because I have a really good memory for this stuff because I love it. And that's really common for if you have a hyperfixation or a special interest to have a really good memory for this stuff. It's also allowed me to have this podcast. I mean, I couldn't do stuff like this if I didn't do hours of research. And it might seem abnormal to people on the outside because there are a lot of days when I will get off work and I will literally spend 8 hours watching medical conferences and reading papers and stuff like that. And I get that seems weird to the neurotypicals. But it brings me joy. It makes me feel happy and fulfilled. Literally sometimes when I get a new study that's like something interesting that I can really sink my teeth into, if I read it too close to bed, I can't sleep because I just get too excited wanting to read it all. Like I've stayed up all night reading 70-page research papers before because I think it's fun. And so if someone were to pathologize that and tell me that's unhealthy and I need to address it and it's threatening my mental health, I would be devastated if I didn't know any better. So that's where clinicians, it's super important to check in and see like what impact these quote unquote obsessive behaviors, probably not quotes, it probably is objectively obsessive, but like you have to check in and see the impact that it's having on people. It's also important to continuously check in. So I've had special interests and hyperfixations take a turn for the worse as well. And that's when it's important to intervene. So another example from my life is during COVID, I had to do research to get new furniture. My cats like to consume anything upholstered, and so they like ate the arms on my couch, like literally were like eating the stuffing out of the arms on my couch. And they destroyed a really nice recliner and stuff. And so I was like, I have to get new furniture that is like completely cat proof, so like outdoor furniture. And so at that point I actually developed a bit of a hyperfixation on interior design. So I ended up spending months and months doing research on couches and chairs, and it got to the point where, and still this is true to this day, I can go into like design museums and I'll see like a chair or something like that, and I'll know exactly like what decade it came from, who the manufacturer was. Like I can name all the notable advancements in chair technology in the 20th century. I learned a lot about couches and chairs. And so this was during COVID, so it was pretty normal actually to not go out after work. But what I would do is after work, I would sit and just scroll on like furniture websites for 8 hours a day. And this was really enjoyable for me for the first 8 months. And I still do look back on this time period fondly because interior design has become something that's like very important to me and my sense of identity. But the problem came at around the 8-month mark or the 9-month mark or something when I was trying to order a couch. And I just got so anxious because it was like, I'm never going to find the perfect couch. And so I'd come close to ordering one and then I would go back and do more research. And this just kept repeating and it was like actually genuinely causing me distress. And so the really good thing is that my therapist picked up on the fact that it was causing distress, and that's when she decided to intervene. So at that point, she was like, okay, you're going to just pick out a couch. Like she didn't literally tell me that because therapists aren't supposed to like tell you what to do. They're not supposed to make decisions for you. But we had a good therapy session and that was, or a number of sessions. And that was what we decided would be the best course of action for me so that I could stop getting so anxious about finding the perfect couch and just get a darn couch because I knew every furniture website inside and out. And so I think that's a really good example of when hyperfixations can turn toxic. And I think that's something that all neurodivergent people and their therapists should be aware of. But to me, I don't know that that feels like OCD, just from the standpoint that like, yes, I meet the criteria for like, did I spend 8 hours a day thinking about furniture? Yeah, absolutely. Did it cause distress? Yeah, towards the end it absolutely did. But once I got the couch, it went away. It was over. And so that's not really typical of OCD. With OCD, engage in compulsions to alleviate the thought, but the thought will still come back. Or you might even find a new thing to be anxious about and have the recurring intrusive thoughts over if you somehow completely overcame the last set of intrusive thoughts. And so that just wasn't the case for me. Like the couch was the end of it. And so to me, it just feels like a hyperfixation gone wrong. Now, the last example I want to give is the plastic one and talk about that a little bit more in depth. And this one is probably the closest to what you maybe could argue is OCD. And to be honest, I don't know. I don't know for sure if this would be OCD or not. My sense is that it's not, but if there's any listeners out there that feel really strongly one way or another, would love to hear your take, particularly folks who have OCD. We have a video linked in the description section with people who are both autistic and OCD. And so I really recommend that folks give that a listen if they want to hear that from the perspective of folks who like definitively have OCD. But if folks want to chime in on this story, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Anyway, this was the plastic episode, and I've always had concerns about plastic waste, but there was a point in time, and I don't really remember, when it just got a lot worse. And maybe it was just seeing some of the news about like plastic sticking around. And this was a number of years ago. So I guess to jump a little bit ahead in the story, the good news is that I did get treatment, and now with all the recent news about like PFAS coming out, it bothers me to the extent that it probably bothers most humans reading about like forever chemicals. But it's not something that I'm obsessing over. Once I close the article, I don't really think about it again for the rest of the day. And so I hope that this gives people hope, whether it's your typical like ADHD and autistic anxiety, or whether it's OCD. there are treatment options available and they can work. But at any rate, this was a couple years ago, and my anxieties about plastic really intensified, and just the thought of like stuff existing forever in our landfills like really got to me. And so what started happening is when I would go out in public and I would see someone like throwing away a water bottle into a trash can instead of a recycling bin, I would have this overwhelming urge to go and like fish it out of the trash can. And I never did do that because I was like afraid of scraping at my hand and getting tetanus. Listeners, do not stick your hand in a trash can. That's very unsafe. So luckily, thank God I never did that. But I would think about it all day long, and I would feel like dirty and guilty because I didn't go fish it out of the trash can. Like I would feel like it's directly my fault for like allowing this plastic to sit in a landfill forever. And the similar thing would happen too when I was in like a bathroom. I would have this overwhelming, like icky, yucky feeling when I would see people using paper towels instead of like a hand dryer, and especially if they would use a bunch of pieces of paper towels. And so this wasn't coming from a super rational place, especially the paper towel one, just because like paper towels are not gonna make a huge difference. They're like compostable and it's from trees. But at the time, I didn't have the same frame of reference. Like it just felt overwhelming, and I would just sit and think about it all day long. And so I was trying to eliminate plastic from my routine. And on the surface, I would be really good at this type of thing. Like I'm good at research, but it quickly became overwhelming. So for example, I wanted to buy a new shower curtain, and I didn't want to get a plastic shower curtain because that's like a net new sheet of plastic. And then I do research and I'm like, I'm going to buy cotton. But then it turns out cotton is really water intensive. Okay, I'm going to buy bamboo. It turns out bamboo as a grass is like a really renewable resource, but then it takes a lot of chemicals to convert it into a fabric. Okay, I'm going to buy hemp. Well, a hemp shower curtain is $80 on Amazon. Do I really want an $80 shower curtain? And you can imagine it was that same process with everything in my routine. It was shampoos, conditioners, floss, clothing, food products, on and on and on. And I would go through that spiral with every single product. And so my therapist started to notice that this was becoming problematic. And so what we did is something called ERP, or exposure response prevention therapy. So this is a pretty standard treatment for OCD. This is like the gold standard. Sometimes you'll hear about cognitive behavioral therapy, but I do want to warn all our listeners out there. It's pretty well known that CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, does not work as well for neurodivergent people, particularly autistic people, unless it's modified. So be aware of that if you're seeking out treatment. And in general, just pure CBT doesn't really work super well for OCD unless it's coupled with ERP, or exposure response prevention therapy. So anyway, we did ERP. And what that consists of is like, first of all, your therapist is going to teach you some techniques for how to manage distressing situations. Like it's not the most pleasant treatment, but you can get through it because they will generally help you to learn distress tolerance, and they'll take it at your speed. And then basically you get closer and closer to your triggers. So I think mine was more of like, you could call it an abbreviated ERP. It wasn't like a really long drawn out process. And what we just agreed on is like, I'm going to throw some water bottles in the trash, or I'm going to use a paper towel instead of a hand dryer. And at first it felt horrible, it felt really yucky and awful. But then over time I acclimated and it became more manageable. If you were doing more of like a full-blown ERP, it might take a lot longer. And so an example of that would be if you were convinced that you were going to like drown in a swimming pool, and so you like couldn't get near bodies of water. What they might do after they've taught you appropriate distress tolerance is, for week 1, you might drive past a swimming pool, and then they would check in and make sure that you're like managing the associated distress with that appropriately. Then week 2, they might have you sit in the pool area and not get in, but just sit in a lawn chair next to a pool and make sure that you're managing the distress with that. Okay. Then week 3, you might dip a toe in. Week 4, you might wade in the kiddie pool. Week 5, you might splash your legs in, and kind of so on and so on until you've been exposed sufficiently to the trigger that you don't really have those distressing thoughts anymore. And so that therapy does work. I hope that if there are any listeners out there for whom these descriptions really resonate, that you go and please check in with a specialist who specializes in OCD, because not every clinician is qualified to treat OCD. It can be kind of a specialized thing. One of the kind of awful statistics is that the time of onset to treatment is 15 years. So that means that from the point in time when you first start feeling symptoms until the time at which you get treatment, on average, is 15 years. So if you're listening and any part of this resonates, please take this as a sign to go get checked out, because you don't have to live like that anymore. And these treatments really can work for a lot of people. The ERP combined with medication or alone can help people manage these conditions. So that's our episode. I hope that this was informative. If you have OCD and you're listening, please, we would love to hear from you, and we would love to hear you describe the condition in your own words, because we want to represent diverse voices on this podcast. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.